Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this webinar hosted by the Asia Pacific Financial Wellness Initiative, which is led by myself and my wonderful colleague, Anna Perera-Shaw. We have a really exciting topic to discuss today, which is all about housing. But before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So today we have two fantastic panelists, which we're going to introduce to you very shortly, and they'll be talking about the importance of providing secure housing. All of the research shows that stable housing is one of the most important elements, not just for financial resilience, health and well-being, but also for mental and physical health. So without further ado, over to you, Anna, for this wonderful panel discussion today.
Great, thanks, Vinita. And I'm really excited for this topic today, especially in the current climate we're in, with housing affordability being so front of mind, mortgage stress, increasing cost of living, rising rates. There's been a lot of discussion in the media about housing affordability, and our discussion today will have a specific focus on housing affordability for essential workers, with a focus on an impact investment solution that will help to make housing more accessible and more affordable, which is, as mentioned, becoming more and more important. So with me on the panel today is Tim Buskens, who is the CEO of Hope Housing, and Greg McKenna, who is the CEO of Police Bank. And I'll hand over to each of them to introduce themselves in a little bit more detail, but just want to say thanks upfront for being here and for being part of this discussion. And I'm really looking forward to getting into the detail about Hope Housing and the partnership with Police Bank. So I might start with you, Greg, to introduce yourself and let us know, what, I guess, maybe why this topic is something that is important to you. And I know we'll get into more detail as we discuss, we get into the detail about, why this partnership emerged and get into the detail about Hope Housing, but maybe just why, at a high level, why this topic's important to you.
Yep. Thanks, Anna, and thanks, Vinita. It's great to be here with Tim to talk to you today. I guess I grew up in Guildford, and on my side of the street there were privately owned houses, and on the other side of the street we had the housing commission houses. My grandparents, my mum grew up in a housing commission house, and from that security that folks were able to get back 40, 50 years ago, it doesn't seem to exist in the same way that it used to. And that I find is troubling from a fairness point of view. I think it's a problem for our egalitarian nature of being Australian, and ultimately it's something that somehow we need to adjust. So I'm the CEO of Police Bank. We are an organisation that was started by police back almost 60 years ago. It's now by members for members, and so we've got that kind of ethos about trying to look after one another. We are a mutual bank, and so when it comes to housing, I really do think that there's been a structural shift that's leaving some people behind. Part of it's demographic, but it's something that we need to address if we can, and it's something that I'm really passionate about.
Fantastic. And I think it'd be good for us later on in our discussion to get into the value of the mutual banking model as well, and in supporting some of supporting this area as well would be great, as I think it's a sector that is really well positioned to make significant impact, particularly in communities, and thinking about essential workers as well. Yeah. So thank you, Greg. Now, Tim.
Thanks. And following from Greg, yes, it's a pleasure to be here. So thanks, Anna and Vinita, for this opportunity. I also think, like Greg, it's a very personal piece for me. I come from this from a point of view of looking at my family, my three boys. I've been very fortunate in that I was born at the right time in the right country, early 70s, was able to enter the housing market at a time that was right and benefit a lot from that housing market, and was able to, very fortunate in my career in terms of working in financial services and superannuation and the like. And I get to a point of, I've got to a point in time where I've said, I was very fortunate. I benefited from it. What can I do now to utilise my skills and experience to actually give back and not only make a difference, to go back to my three boys, make a difference from them, but make a difference for that future generation. Looking at housing as a problem. It's a problem now, and it's just going to get worse. So it's the time now to make a difference.
Absolutely. And I think that recognition of how times have changed is really important, and something that sometimes gets overlooked when thinking about, what are the younger generations doing now to save for a home. We've actually seen in RFI Global data that younger people have become less likely to indicate their top savings goal is for a home. It used to be the top. It was fairly strong in the last couple of years with the pandemic when rates were low, but we have seen that drop off slightly. So is it because people are just feeling that it's too hard, it's too difficult, it's too hard to get into the market, it's just not an option? So I think thinking and reimagining ways to help people get into the housing market is really critical, but also appreciate that recognition, that the fact that over the decades it has become different. Buying a home has become a different experience. Incomes have changed, the opportunities have shifted, prices have changed dramatically, and I think that's a really good starting point for our first question as well, when we think about what the biggest needs are in the housing market, and potentially as well, are there any new challenges that have emerged as we think about increasing cost of living and rising rates? And Greg, I might start this question with you. When you think about what these needs are and how this has changed over time.
Yeah, I think the number one thing we need for the housing market, realistically, is more supply. If you think about Australia as a relatively young country, a couple of 100 years old, the cities have got bigger and bigger and bigger, and we've been able to increase capacity as our population grew. When I was a young fellow, we were half the size or less than what we are now. And of course, we've got this concentration into Sydney and Melbourne and other big cities. So I think that one of the issues we need to deal with is balance, generational balance between people 50 or older like me and the youngsters coming through. And that means that we need maybe different planning laws. We need more medium density. We need a recognition that the thing that sets us apart, if we really do want Australia to be Australia, is that we have been able to be egalitarian, or we are egalitarian. Housing security is pretty solid at the moment, but it's going to become less so in the future as people struggle. And I think, maybe if a bit more like Singapore, a bit more like Japan, more medium density kind of housing, that'll make a big difference. Because the reality is, immigration is going to be a continued fuel that drives the Australian economy. Because people want to live here, it's a great place to live, but also because that's what we need. We need to continually bring skills in and that sort of things. And if you look at the history of any nation for the last 500 or 1,000 years, it's the ebb and flow of population that really does impact on economic growth and all those kind of things. It used to be war and pestilence. We had a small example of that during COVID, and we saw that immigration fell in a heap and what that did economically. But now people are back. People want to be here. So we've got to find a way to balance out those who want to come here, those who are my age or older, who are already in the market, those who aren't in the market, and then, of course, have that social safety net that sets Australia apart as a Western democracy of being able to look after everybody. So it's a very complex topic, but if you ask me what's the really simple thing that we should do, is we should get more medium density and more supply, and then things will flow from there. But it's really complex.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could probably spend hours just speaking about, how the housing market has changed in the last couple of decades and how that compares to global markets. But I think that's a really good summary to start us off when we think about, some of the challenges that people are facing, especially younger people. And that will be part of our discussion as we think about, people in different industries and younger people as well, who will be starting their careers in certain sectors and thinking about, can they afford to live where they want to live, or is there a shift towards, people seeking outside of metropolitan cities because they just simply can't afford it. So part of our discussion is about innovation and impact investment and social impact. So it'd be great to hear from you, Tim, in terms of Hope Housing, which will be kind of core to our discussion today. It'd be great to understand the problem that Hope Housing seeks to address, and also just an overview of how the model works and what it aims to do.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So the problem we seek to address is relatively simple. It's about enabling housing attainability, and we're focusing on essential workforce, helping them live closer to where they work. When I sort of turn my mind to housing and sort of building off what Greg was saying, it is a complex issue, and there are a lot of levers in terms of and a lot of dynamics in the housing problem. But what we're really looking to address is the fact that if we look at essential workforce, for them to access homes, and they're on, medium incomes of 80 to 120, so they're not, they're reasonable incomes. For them to access homes, they're either being forced into inner city rental accommodation, or if they want to get a security, they're pushed out to outer rim and they're travelling, over 2 hours, 1.5 to 2 hours to work. And so it's really looking at that group and saying, how do we enable attainability for those people close to where they work? That's essentially a problem. How do we do that? Let me first start with an example that assumes no hope. Hope's not part of the equation. What's happening right now? An essential worker would come into a bank, and Greg can correct me here, but essential worker can come into a bank. Generally, there's APRA guidelines around and credit assessments that occur, but rule of thumb, 5 to 6 times earning is what a borrowing capacity of essential worker. And just to keep the math really simple, $100,000 income, household income, they're looking at 500 to 600,000 mortgage. That's the sort of rule of thumb, assuming they've saved 100,000, and then after stamp duty and other various costs, if they're not first home buyers, they're in the buying range of that sort of 600,000 to 700,000. That's what they can afford from a house. Medium prices in Sydney and Melbourne over $1 million. So immediately there's a gap there. So where does Hope play in? We come in as a partner, a co-investor. Shared equity is the common terminology used. And Greg and I have been working in really close in partnership and how we sort of mesh our shared equity component with the banking component. So in the Hope police bank model, what we immediately do with that same essential worker is we say, well, you lend, will you borrow less? The bank will reduce its lend from that 600,000 thereabouts down to about 450, and then the homeowner can put in 50,000 of their deposit. So brings them up to sort of 500,000 buying power, or 50% of the home. And then Hope will provide an equity contribution as a silent partner for the other 500,000. So immediately we're starting to change the dynamic for that homeowner, where the pressure is off them from a family budget because they're borrowing less, but they're able to obtain a medium price home within a suburb close to where they work. That's the simple framework and how Hope operates with Police Bank.
And if I may, the benefits that flow from that for the community, for the family, mum or dad, if they're in the job, they can coach footy or they can coach netball. They can be there. They don't have to drive 2 hours after a long shift, as Tim said. And that having those folks in the community they serve is a non-quantifiable dollar value, which these days economically people underappreciate. But it's just such an important give back to that community. And then it's also so important for the worker and their family that after a long shift, they don't have to drive up in New South Wales, the M1 from Sydney to the Central Coast, or head back down to Wollongong or somewhere, or take an hour and a half to get out to the outskirts. So what Hope does is it allows those essential workers who really want to live closer to the community that they're served to be part of that community. It's just the non-dollar benefits that hope gives to society are just incredible.
Yeah, there's extra positive impacts that are beyond monetary are so profoundly important, especially the point you make about the physical distance or the travel that they're on, maybe driving for 2 hours to get to work. And essential workers commonly aren't doing a 7-hour day, 12 hours, 14 hours, and then to drive home. You want essential workers to be rested, having time with their family, having work-life balance, but also able to perform in their essential roles. And to add on to that, such a commute, can imagine, just makes it extra challenging. But I also like that point you make about the impact on the community. So it's potentially a police officer who works with the community, in the community throughout the week, and then on the weekend he's in the local cafe, he's around, he's present, he's seeing things, he's making connections, or they are making connections. And it's, I think, a really positive unintended benefit, or I guess you have intended it as part of the model, but it's something that could have some really positive flow-on effects beyond just they can get to work a little bit easier. It's that community connection that flows through to really having a big impact. But Tim, I also like the point you made about the financial pressure. So there's kind of that financial wellness element where you're helping them borrow less, which means when rates are rising, when people are feeling the pressure with mortgage stress, it's actually they're in a better position where then they haven't absolutely maxed out their borrowing. They haven't got absolutely maximum capacity with no budget left. So, even to spend the money on the petrol is probably a decision between, what can I make for dinner for my family versus how much petrol do I need to get to work to get the money that flows through the family budget. So that other element of supporting the budget by reducing that financial pressure, I think, is also a really interesting and unique angle there with that model. So there's a few different components here that I think make it a really interesting example of both financial wellness, but also that social impact as well. And I did read an article that was talking about some research that Hope Housing did, which did show that essential workers are particularly susceptible to burnout, financial stress, and also being shut out of home ownership, especially given the fact that these are often workers that can't work from home, especially having to be there in person to deal with the community, or if it's a nurse or someone who has an in-person role. Are there any other positive flow-on effects that you think, even in the long term, for someone who is able to buy a home and be there for 5-10 years or more, and not have to be traveling so much, maybe things like career progression or retaining talent for really good staff?
I can take that one.
Yeah.
So think about maybe New South Wales Police Force, for example. That's my patch, right? There are some really good cops outside Sydney. It's really difficult to take a promotion to come into Sydney, because if you've got to move your family without hope, it becomes cost prohibitive. So from a career progression point of view, just in that single example, and that'll be similar for fireys, and probably the same, like who wouldn't want to live, up in Newcastle or somewhere like that? But there'll be opportunities down in Sydney that folks will want to take, whether they're in nursing or teaching or any of the essential workers. But that's then got to be balanced about, well, can we actually afford it? And then you get that issue that we're trying to avoid, which is, I can afford it, but I'm going to drive down the M1, and I'm going to be in that car with three other cops or 3 other nurses or 3 other, however it might work. But the career progression is definitely a thing that this helps aid as well, just as a single point. But I'll hand back to Tim. Sorry, I jumped in there, Tim. Got excited about that one.
No, as it demonstrates a partnership in our combined passion of what we're trying, or what we're delivering here. I mean that's right. Career is another element, but I'll take it from a different point of view. The employer. So we've spoken about the worker, and there's some clear benefits in terms of less stress and better work-life balance, and ensuring that they've got how do you behave with security sitting behind you, and building wealth. And we'll go into that a little bit further, which will, I think, feed into some of Vinita's objectives in her organisation. Then you've got obviously the community. How does the community feel? How does the community react? They're being part of the community, but also the community benefiting from having a diversified essential workforce within there. A nurse or a teacher or a police officer or a cleaner or a paramedic, someone turning up and serving the community that has feeling of greater happiness and security is going to absolutely deliver a better outcome to that community. No doubt about that. And then we talk about the point you touched on about career, but let's turn that around. Employers. One of the big challenges employers are having right now, and particularly employers that are looking at essential services, how do we attract, retain, develop our workforce? You're hearing stories in the aged care sector. With an aging population, aged care are forcing to close down various facilities because they can't access the staffing they need, and not only just staffing, but qualified staffing needed for that sector. I had a recent experience with a friend of mine. She just had a child and she went to Randwick Hospital. And she observed there was 2 groups of nurses in the hospital looking after her just after her first child. One really old group, very well, very well experienced and really knew what they were doing. And a very first year straight out, there was a complete bottoming or complete devoid of that mid-level of experience. And she actually asked, because she knew what I was doing, and she asked the nursing staff, I noticed you're either, and she could only ask in a way that didn't sound, but I noticed you're either like really old, experienced or young. I said, yeah, what happens is when the recruits come through, they serve in the hospital for 12 months and they go to Wollongong or they go to Newcastle or they go out to the regions. Yeah, because they're forcing, they don't want to be travelling in this way. And so what happens to the Randwick Hospital when that age group starts to retire? The police station in, Central CBD, which is just around from my office, we had a chat to the cops down in there, or police officers down there, and that's their first posting out of Goulburn. And then what happens after I think it's three years, Greg, right. But yeah. After that, they're off. So the experience within those employment areas are low and limited. So from an employer's perspective as well, it's how do they, be able to serve the community as an employer, attract and retain the staff, and it goes a bit into go back to my boys, which sort of gets me quite passionate, quite fired up. If I look at them, so we're talking about what's happening today. If I look at them, they're early to mid-teens. My eldest is just going to year 11 and he's thinking about, in his HSC and thinking about uni. And I think about their career progression. And it touches a little bit on the supply point that Greg made. And we're seeing supply, but we're seeing a lot of supply from a rental perspective. Build to rent is sort of a bit of a flavour of the month. And I look at them and I say, wow, I'm now talking to you about your future roles, your future careers, and housing has been so fundamentally important to the welfare of Australians. And so I say you've got to look at ways to buy a house. You've got to look at ways to access and attain a house. That's pushing them into this white-collar, high-paid, professional financial services. They could become bankers, Greg. They could become financiers. They could become fund managers. But it's pushing them all into that, but away from the next generation of teachers, next generation of police, next generation of essential workers. Because I'm sitting there saying, do I want a generation of tenants that haven't got the ability to attain homes? Or do I want, you're going into that because, you want to go and serve your community? Or do we want to, we want to promote that generation just tenants, or we want to look for solutions now that enable those essential workers to obtain homes. So I get quite passionate with when I start doing my family.
Part of that, though, also is we need more balance in rentals. The fact that folks can get kicked out, at short notice, and a single mum with a couple of kids, might have to move around almost every 12 months. Those sort of things. There needs to be more security on that for those folks who that's what either they can afford or they want to do. But from a buying point of view or an owning point of view, we definitely do need to get more balance as well. And as I say, more supply I think would be an important part of it. And I think the reality is, if we recognise that the Australian population is going to continue to grow and that demand is going to continue to grow, more supply, even medium density in suburbs that don't want medium density, is not going to affect the property prices negatively, because the pie just keeps getting bigger because the population keeps growing.
Yeah, it's a good point as well about when you're renting, you don't have that stability, especially your example of a mum with a couple of kids. It's at the moment, the rental market is so competitive as well. So you might have secured something finally, and then in 6 months, you find out that they don't want you there anymore. They're going to sell. They're aiming to get a different tenant, and people are offering a lot more for listed properties for rent than what they were offering 2-3 years ago. Especially in the pandemic, the rental rates were quite low because there wasn't that demand, and now suddenly it's the opposite, where you get 50 people showing up for a rental inspection, and makes it not that much of a even playing field. Which I think, Tim, you made a good point about the future generation, thinking about the careers they are aspiring to get into. Are they going to aspire to be an essential worker, knowing what the conditions are like, knowing it's going to be difficult to work where they grew up? Or are they thinking, I just have to aim for the corporate sector? Thinking about what do people actually want to do? What opportunities are they aspiring for? And, making sure that the people who are in different industries really want to be there where possible. I mean, you can't always work in areas that you absolutely love, but the people who are in essential work, you want them to be looked after, and you want there to be a new generation of people who are aspiring to do this. So it's an interesting challenge as well, but something that Hope Housing has an interesting approach as well to potentially supporting that if housing could become a little bit more affordable. And we've kind of already, Greg?
I was just going to say that the beauty of Hope Housing is it recognises something that the community seems to have forgotten, or certainly politics and rampant capitalism's forgotten. Those people are doing a service for the community. They don't get paid like bankers. They get paid like essential workers, and we have to find a way as a community to give back. And whether it's through Hope, whether it's through someone like Aware Super putting money into Hope, whether it's any of the other big super funds, these are their members. And so that's that balance. This whole housing question is about balance. And so that's one of the beautiful things about Hope, is that you have got those people who did grow up and say, I want to serve. I'd like to be a nurse. I'd like to be a teacher. I'd like to be a police officer or whatever. And the community takes, but they only ever really give back in a mega way when something bad happens, as we just saw recently. So I think Hope's at the vanguard of recognising and saying, hey, thanks for your service, and in real time, here's something we're going to do for you. Sorry, I just had to say that I'm very passionate about Hope. I think it's just the most amazing thing.
No, I really like that recognition about the importance of the essential workers, and you're exactly right. People expect it to be there for decades to come, but it's not going to be there if no one is able to work there, or they have to make a choice to live in the suburb that they love, that their family lives in, that their parents live in, or have to move 2-3 hours out to be in an industry that potentially isn't as appreciated or supported as it should be. So your point about partnerships is really key, and also gives us a nice segue into my question about the partnership with Police Bank. I'd love to know about, firstly, how that partnership came about, but also the value you see in these partnerships with, you mentioned Aware Super, a member-owned bank such as Police Bank. So could you give us some background on that partnership and also the value you see in these kinds of partnerships, Greg?
Yeah, so we got introduced, so Police Bank was introduced to Hope through the connection of our chair, Peter Emprey, and one of the advisory board members on on Hope's board, Michael Dwyer. They'd had dealings in the past, and as soon as Peter and Michael brought the idea to me, and I bit straight away. This is exactly the kind of thing that a mutual bank like Police Bank should be trying to do. Banking's a really tough competitive game these days, right? I could give you the lowest rates on home loans. I could give you the highest rates on deposits. And that's not necessarily going to cut through in the way that doing something like Hope will actually give back to the community that I'm trying to serve. All banks have to, grow their balance sheets and all that kind of stuff, right? But in their essence, the point of Police Bank is by members for members. And so the essential worker program, because obviously, we're Police Bank, but all of these other people are adjacent to our core membership and are right in the stream of people that we want to serve. So, and then over the next couple of years, Tim and myself sponsored our teams to work through all the paperwork, and that wasn't the easiest thing in the world, because we've got a philanthropic idea with a fund behind it on the one side, and we've got a bank and bank regulation on the other side. And we've come up with what I think is a really elegant solution that covers all parties. And the thing that Tim and I had as our core kind of tenet was it's got to be fair to the investor, and it's got to be fair to the homeowner, and they both co-invest together. And we think we know. We've come up with a solution that is really, fair. Fairness or fair is a word that doesn't get used enough, but that's what we've done. So we bit because it's right in our wheelhouse and really compatible with our ethos, which is, serving, those who serve our community. And it's a nice way for us to be able to, help them achieve financial well-being, because at the end of the day, that's what we all want. From time immemorial, most humans they just want to feel secure. And whether that's secure in a house or secure knowing that they can pay their bills next week, this aids in those things. We get to cover off a few of Maslow's hierarchies by working with Hope and serving our joint members.
Yeah, I suppose a couple of things I would say to, I guess, echo and probably amplify what Greg's already said. First key point for me, Greg looks at the people that he's helping as members, not customers, they're members. And I know that's a mutual banking piece. This is a sector that has a member focus. And when you have a member focus, it's less churn. It's more, how do we help them? What do we need to do to help them? And as Greg said, there's obviously, you could pay high interest rates and have, low cost products, but there are, and Greg is an absolute leader in the field where he sort of thinks outside of that product structure and says, what else can we do to help our members? The other point is that very early on, and Greg used that comment, he used the term today, hope is a solution. Very early on, he said, what I like about this is you're not developing a product, you've got a solution. The product essentially the mortgage, the loan, that's fairly well tried and true, and everyone understands that. But here we are as a solution that can be delivered to our members when they're finding challenges of utilising the mortgage product to access and attain housing close to where they work. And then when you start looking at it through that lens, this, and to the point, there's a bit of work between us and Police Bank, then it's, okay, well, how do you mesh now the traditional thinking around the mortgage product and the additional solution that is being delivered through this shared equity. And that meshing is, how do you bring within an asset, the traditional house, now effectively three parties? The homeowner themselves, obviously, with their equity and their deposit, the bank interest, and then the institutional investment that will sit alongside that. And this is really the IP piece that Greg and I started developing through and really thinking about, that hasn't, from what I've seen looking across the world, looking across the globe, hasn't really started to be delivered yet. There's shared equity out there, but looking at other models, they're just like taking an existing product and bolting something on. They're not working out how those two mesh and interact together. That is the critical element. That's what I think will take us to this next generation of saying, how do we then start to scale and expand? And I'll suck up all the capacity that Greg has in his bank mortgaging element, and then we'll say, well, we'll work out then from there, taking on the world.
Yeah, and honestly, this is right in the wheelhouse of not just Police Bank, but other mutuals as well. And there are a number, probably every single one, I would think, would, when we prove this concept and take it to the next stage of genuine and large institutional investor interest, then we can really expand it, and this will be something that really delivers for all the parties, whether it's the mutual bank, whether it's the investor in hope, or whether it's the homeowner. It'll deliver for all three of those in equal measure.
I guess the question that ties in then, following the points that were made then, is scaling the impact. So what do you think needs to be done for Hope and Police Bank to scale the impact that they're having, and what's the ask of the investment community? What do you need from the community to help make this work and make such a strong social impact?
Do you want me to take that one? Start with that one, Greg?
Yeah. I'm the homeowner side. I can fill whatever you can provide.
Yeah, so that I think that's a good point. I mean, there's no lack of demand, and we're still in that pilot phase. And Greg's team, I think did a fairly targeted, but relatively quiet marketing campaign, and that just exploded. I think the servers at the Police Bank network, and there were just a huge amount of members looking for that.
Can I just, if investors are worried about this not being big, this as a solution not being big enough to move the needle on their fund, I can guarantee that is not the case. Whether it's $1 billion or $5 billion, I don't actually know what the upside of this as a product is. But when you think about how many essential workers there are in the capital cities and the adjacent areas of Australia, there is not going to be any issue if funds are worried about, only $500 million will move the needle, or only 100 million, or whatever that number is. So the demand side will be there. And sorry, Tim, I interrupted.
No, mate, that's a cool part of it. I'm happy. Good to interrupt. But yeah, so I mean, the demand side is absolutely there. In terms of the investor ask, I mean, it's a pretty straightforward and simple ask. Residential property is a long-term growth asset that has a relatively low volatility, to utilize some investment speak. So through recessions and global crisis and interest rate hikes and whatever's happening in the economy, residential property grows, because fundamentally, even though we are looking at always building more, there is a supply-demand mismatch. We've got a growing economy. We're getting more people coming through. There's greater demand. And residential property is one of those asset classes that has a stable long-term growth trajectory. It's also one of those asset classes that we all really understand well in a retail mums and dads environment, but has no exposure apart from some build to rental assets, but no exposure in institutional investors. $10 trillion of asset value has no exposure in institutional investors. So effectively what we're delivering is a wholesale way for institutional investors to access that asset class and benefit from that long-term stable growth over time.
Yeah.
With at the same time, all the things we just spoke about, delivering to the community a real social dividend that has the ability for us to measure, monitor, and report on. We had, and I haven't raised it yet, but we did have Centre of Social Impact through the University of New South Wales actually think about, and we wanted to start with thinking about what is our social impact, what is the value that we are actually delivering. And without too much effort, just looking at sort of high-level academic research, we're able to quantify 30 cents in every dollar invested is a social dividend. And that 30 cents, there were a lot of gaps in that. Productivity gaps, infrastructure gaps, happiness and well-being. So that is a very low estimate of what that social dividend can actually achieve. So here we've got institutional investors sitting there saying we don't have access to this significant, growing, large asset class that delivers reliable, consistent returns over time. So what does that do in our portfolio? How does that help us diversify what is already a broad mix of assets? And also, how do we actually do this impact piece and deliver a social dividend that we can grab hold of and demonstrate how that helps Australians not only in the future, but right now.
The answer is hope to that question, by the way.
That's great. I think that's a really good point to potentially end on, just when thinking about, I love the quantification of the social impact as well. I think that's a really, it's a strong way to just think about, beyond what I think everything you're trying to do is so multi-level. There's so many elements to it that are so positive, the flow-on effect to the community, the flow-on effect to the workforce, all the essential industries that could potentially retain staff, get new employees, the example that was given about the very young employees versus the much older, the 1 year tenure versus the 40-year tenure. It's a big gap to have a huge nothing in the middle. And I think it's a really clear example of a need that we need to really think about, especially as we get new people finishing high school and thinking about what do they want to do, what are their opportunities, what do they feel is a feasible option for them, and what do they actually want to do. And for those amazing people that want to be working in the essential industries, how can we make that a bit more of a reality? But also from the institutional side, it's a pretty solid investment that has significant opportunity both on the financial returns and the social returns. So it's quite a compelling case study. And I think, I can imagine this being brought up in uni classes about impact investments. It's a very good example of a proposition that makes a lot of sense. And I think the partnership with mutual banking as well is one that, again, makes a lot of sense. And Greg, I can see why once you heard about it, you were like, yep, this is exactly what we're trying to do. This is what we're looking for. So this has been a really great discussion. Might hand over to you, Vinita, if you have any final thoughts.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Greg and Tim. It's been such a fascinating discussion. And I absolutely love the passion for the partnership, because that's what is the glue that will make everything work. And you're so right. It's so good, Tim, to see, the 30-cent dividend that you mentioned in terms of social impact. This is the kind of quantification that will help your pilot to scale and grow. So, I wish you both the very best for your fantastic pilot opportunity. I hope it grows. And like we said, when we talk about essential workers, you've started with police bank, but there are so many other professions in this space. So I would wish you the very best in terms of scaling it up to reach the other professions as well, so that all of those essential workers can enjoy not just financial health and well-being, which is what we focus on, but also physical and mental health, which is what we've talked about for themselves, their families, and their communities. So I take this opportunity to thank you once again for the fantastic work you're doing and wish you the very best for the future.
Thanks very much.